Welcome, everyone. You have arrived at featured session 5. My name is Mike McMahon. I'm Executive Director of the Hymn Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you. I think we're in for a great hour, and to get us started, I'm going to hand this over to the President-elect of the Hymn Society, Ben Brody.
Well, welcome and good morning. Before we begin our session, a reminder that participants are not able to be seen or heard, but you may make comments or ask questions through the chat or the Q&A features. We'll be monitoring comments and questions throughout the session, and we'll present some of those to the speaker at the conclusion of her talk. Monique Ingalls joined the Baylor Church Music faculty in 2014, prior to which she spent 3 years as a postdoctoral teaching fellow at the University of Cambridge. She co-founded the Christian Congregational Music Local and Global Perspectives Conference, which meets every 2 years in Oxford. I came to know Monique through reading her excellent book, Singing the Congregation: How Contemporary Worship Music Forms Evangelical Community, which was published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. Today, Monique will be leading us in a session titled Musical Modes of Congregating, Rehabilitating a Socio-Musical Term for 21st Century Christian Communities. Monique, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be with you all today. And in one of the afternoon breakout discussion groups earlier this week, we were talking about the different forms of kind of distance and yet intimacy that getting together like this affords us. We can't be together in the flesh, but we get this glimpse into each other's daily lives. So we see the piles of laundry. I think I hid mine. The dog or the cat that's curious about the screen, the kids or grandkids running on and off camera. So while it's true that I am, hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles away from many of you, I'm also able to welcome you into my home today. I'm coming to you from 103 or thereabouts degree Waco, Texas. And my preschool daughters are away today, but you may see my cat go across the screen a couple of times. And I am absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to speak with such a distinguished group of scholars and ministers. And I want to thank Mike and Ben and the Hymn Society again for this invitation. When Brian Hain initially contacted me about speaking with you all, he passed along a recommendation from the organizing committee that I focus on some of the central ideas from my 2018 book, Singing the Congregation, that Ben mentioned a moment ago. So this talk today will largely focus on some key insights that I offer in this book with some new questions and observations sprinkled in there as well. I'm going to start sharing my screen with you now. So I want to start out by laying out the two related questions that will occupy our attention today. First, what is a congregation? And second, how does music, especially singing, help to define what a congregation is? Over the past few years, these are two questions I have returned to again and again in thinking about how to define how music reflects and forms Christian community. When we think about it, we find that trying to define congregational song or singing is maybe more complicated than many of us might have realized. What many of us might think of as textbook examples, quote unquote, of congregational music, so hymnody, for instance, and musical settings of the liturgy, are of course very important, but these are just two among the myriad of Christian song repertories we hear being sung around the world. And we all know that Christian music resounds far beyond the bounds of the church building. We can think of the long legacy of Black hymns of protest or sacred harp singing or the beer and hymns phenomenon. In fact, some Christian music is only performed at community gatherings outside formal church services. Think of songs of Latin American folk Catholicism, for instance. Some music is mainly sung at retreats or camps. Other songs start out as commercial music made for airplay on Christian radio and are later taken up and sung by congregations. Other songs don't start out in Christian communities at all, but are later adopted by them as a meaningful part of worship. Do all of these diverse expressions fall under the purview of congregational song? Or does including all of these disparate songs and practices under the same umbrella stretch the term beyond its usefulness? If every conceivable type of music is potentially congregational, why do we even need a special term for it? So despite these challenges, I'd like to propose that we can still group these diverse expressions together with a common term, that there is something crucial that links these practices together. Rather than looking for a different umbrella term, let's just use the one that we already have: congregational music, congregational song, congregational singing, while revising and expanding our understanding of the congregation to include all the caveats necessary to describe the complex musical life of Christian communities in the 21st century. In attempting to retool the idea of congregations, and by extension, congregational music making, I'd like to consider today, first, some of the new challenges to the traditional definition of a congregation. So applying insights from scholars working in the sociology of religion and in ecclesiology, I think that we can and must reconceive the congregation as an entity that is actively constituted by common practices, rather than an institution with a fixed form and set of characteristics. And then next, the second part of my talk, to differentiate the musical activities that take place within these diverse types of congregation, I'm going to suggest and kind of explain to you the term musical modes of congregating. And then finally, the last section will be an example, the dynamics of one of these musical modes of congregating, the concert congregation. So, defining the congregation. To understand the resonances of congregational song or singing or music making, it's important first to examine what a congregation is considered to be. I pulled one definition of congregation from Nancy Ammerman's work. She is an eminent sociologist and one of the founders of the subfield of congregational studies. And here is her entry in the Oxford Handbook of the Sociology of Religion. She says, quote, "Congregations in their prototypical American form are locally situated, multi-generational, voluntary organizations of people who identify themselves as a distinct religious group and engage in a broad range of religious activities together. They are usually, but not always, associated with some larger tradition and its affiliated regional and national bodies, in other words, a denomination. The space where they meet may or may not be an identifiably religious building, but congregations do typically have a regular meeting place and a regular schedule of religious activities, usually, but not always, at least weekly. With well over 300,000 such congregations, more than 80% of them Protestant, this American pattern has helped to shape how the term is defined. So one of the things, I picked out a few things you'll see bolded in what's in front of you, some things that I want to address. But one of the other things to point out in this is that there are a lot of qualifications in this paragraph, right? Usuallys, typicallys, generallys. And Ammerman makes the important point here that the definition of the congregation has an American and a Protestant slant. But even within US Protestantism, that supposedly prototypical site of the congregation, some of the key characteristics Ammerman mentions here, the bolded ones we'll talk about shortly, have been challenged by new communications technologies and patterns of mobility, not to mention the global pandemic. As the congregation changes shape, its characteristics and even its centrality for Christian spiritual formation and experience have been challenged as well. I want to sketch just a few of the ways that this standard definition of congregation has been complicated. So first, in complicating the congregation, the changing nature of, what it is that we are talking about when we say congregations, One challenge to the, quote, local aspect of congregations has been the rise of the multi-site campus, particularly within evangelical Protestantism. Multi-site churches are those in which there are several gatherings spread across a metropolitan area or region, but where there's usually one pastor whose message is simulcast to multiple locations. And before the pandemic, this kind of church engaged a full 10% of US churchgoers. Live streaming between venues and by extension online removes the need for worshipers to be in the same physical space to consider themselves part of the gathering. We are all well acquainted with this form. I don't need to, tell you who are tuning into a conference on a Zoom call about this. Secondly, though many congregations remain associated with a larger tradition, the regional and national bodies of the early 21st century often look quite different from the denominational structures that are presumed in classic sociological definitions. Both local congregational authority and denominational influence has been threatened by individual access to the worship experience via other means. Quote, non-denominational church congregations are often linked in rhizomatic transnational networks where key individuals, be they pastors or worship leading musicians, provide the sources of connection. And even denominational churches, of course, can be part of partnerships that transcend their denominational affiliation. As an Episcopalian, I've visited several such Episcopal or Church of England parishes in the US and the UK, which were much more profoundly shaped by their partnership with non-denominational congregations or those within other networks than their own regional diocesan or national church culture. Third here, the assumption that congregations are necessarily multi-generational gatherings is certainly being tested. Many of us have heard or perhaps lived the situation where worship style has formed many different kind of sub-congregations within the same church that may have little to no contact with one another. When I lived in Nashville, goodness, over a decade ago now, I attended a large Baptist church that started a Tuesday night service for 18 to 25-year-olds. I was in the very top of that range at that moment, complete with its own service activities and a midweek Bible study group. One could attend this service every week and never come in contact with a 3-year-old, a 40-year-old, or a 90-year-old. In parts of the world like the US Bible Belt, where one is spoiled for choice, some church congregations have moved closer to what popular music scholar Will Straw calls popular music scenes. Like scenes, these congregations often comprise people of a similar age and are produced, to quote Straw, quote, through coalitions and alliances based on shared musical preferences and performance practices, end quote. Fourth of all, there is the issue of blurred lines between the experience of worshiping in a church congregation and then certain other kinds of parachurch organizations. The main part of the definition I gave you a couple of moments ago, that would be locally situated, multi-generational, voluntary organization of people who identify themselves as a distinct religious group and engage in a broad range of religious activities together, who are affiliated with regional and national bodies with a regular meeting time and place, could apply just as easily to college campus ministry groups, some Bible study groups who would otherwise fall under the classification of parachurch organizations. For some church congregations can be described both as local bodies and subsidiaries, if you will, of the Christian commercial music and media industries, powerful worship brands. In Sydney, Australia, the Hills Christian Life Centre, of course, became Hillsong by virtue of the global popularity of its worship music, which makes the church millions upon millions of dollars in revenue every year. In the USA, the Passion Conference for college students came first, and then the personalities at the center of it formed a, quote, local church in the Atlanta area called the Passion Church. And I was living in Nashville at the time that the first meeting of this church was. I was curious, had studied the Passion conferences, so I drove down, and the very first meeting of the Passion Church happened in a sports arena with a couple of thousand people present. And I'm led to believe that this kind of attendance is not the norm for new church plants who don't already have established figures at their center. And finally, we come to the most familiar of these situations, the way that our definitions of a gathered congregation are threatened, expanded by worship online. People with disabilities or chronic illnesses that prevented their physical presence at church, I found are now among the most enthusiastic posters to the Facebook chat during live stream services. And people who have lived far away from beloved congregations are now using live stream services as a way to reconnect with friends. So I've been all of these, this is kind of exhaustive, examples to show that the gatherings that challenge our institutional definitions of congregation are not outliers, though there still may be many Christian religious bodies that exhibit the traditional characteristics of a congregation in structure. My point is that Christian congregations themselves have changed shape in response to other changes in the social and technological ecosystem. And other sorts of gatherings for worship have become influential and experientially powerful. As a result, congregations have emerged that are increasingly diffuse, sometimes difficult to categorize, and that are linked in increasingly complex ways with other sorts of organizations and industries. So this is one of the pause moments in my talk. We'll talk about the challenge of human experience in a minute, but I do want to pause for a moment. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask if anybody has any comments, questions, things to add from some of their experiences with the challenges to congregation that we are living through.
So I'm seeing a couple of comments, but they're mainly simply just confirming what you said about, especially in this online environment, about the ways congregational identity is changing.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I will continue then.
Well, there's one.
Oh, here's a comment. Okay, so
yeah.
Jan Craybill asks, she says, regarding the term congregation, have you encountered gatherings who prefer that they not be called congregation at all due to the traditional nature of the term, like hymn being associated with traditional interpretations? Jan, that's an excellent observation, and absolutely, in some ways, my use of the term congregation here is, is laying it onto some gatherings that some would call congregations. I have heard, congregation as a term invoked at things like worship concerts that we'll talk about a little bit later, and other events. And I think in some ways, maybe congregation can be used also as an appeal to legitimacy, as an appeal to, this is in line with, what we are doing at our local church congregation. But absolutely, I mean, we've seen, certainly there are a lot of examples of even congregations in the typical sense, in the sense of that definition from Nancy Ammerman that I gave you earlier, that don't call themselves congregations. They call themselves gatherings or communities or, whatever else, because of the resonances of that term. So I recognize, and thank you, Jan, for bringing that up, that it is a congregation does have a number of resonances, but I think that its usefulness, particularly for those of us who are scholars and ministers, outweighs some of the the negative associations that some might have. Ooh, I see a lot.
Yes, there are a couple of interesting comments. Like Peter Raywald points out that the word congregant groups is being used in a secular way by public health officials. And in the UK, Janet Wooten tells us that there are a lot of monolingual congregations that are elderly. We tend to think of them as identified with youth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are excellent examples. And I think, yeah, congregant groups, that's fascinating. The definition, people who gather together in a single place for a specific purpose. That is a lot more in line, I think, with where I'll be going next in in this talk, and along the lines of what some ecclesiologists are proposing as well. And then one other comment that the last comment that I'll address and then move on to talking about experience. Steph Budway asks, what can churches who are now online for the first time learn from those who have been online for quite some time? Yes, when we can't meet physically, and then continuing to keep an online presence even when we can meet in person again. Steph, I think that's such an important thing to bring up, and it's something that I've heard from a lot of ministers, in my own denomination, kind of Episcopal churches here in Waco and the Diocese of Texas, that are saying, a live stream is something that we meant to do. It's been on our list. It's been kind of low on our priority list. And had we known just the degree of participation and of excitement for some of the types of people that I mentioned earlier, who either aren't comfortable in a service, maybe they have severe agoraphobia, maybe their health is too fragile. These priests and ministers are saying, if we'd only known what a powerful tool this was, we would have started live streaming a long time ago. But now that we were forced by the global pandemic to do it, we're going to keep doing it. Think of the churches that I've heard of that have been forced to go on live stream. So many are saying, yes, we look forward to that time that we're going to gather in the flesh again. But this is such an important outlet that we do need to keep it, and we need to start looking for best practices. And I think that there is a lot that churches who have been doing this for a while have to teach us. But I say we could talk a lot more about that, and I'm sure that we may in our wrap-up discussion. But I think I'm gonna go ahead and move on with the next section. Thanks for your interaction. So the challenge of human experience. What do we do with that ever-present challenge to institutional structures? However significant local church congregations in their various forms may be, making them the, quote, authentic locus of what constitutes congregational singing fails to take account of the lived experience of many Christians whose devotional activities are facilitated by common practices, particularly for our purposes, participatory music making that range across many different social spaces. And that this is particularly true within forms of Christianity where religious authority is diffuse and there's a range of choices, in the religious marketplace from which individuals can choose. In these situations, and I'm thinking particularly of my own work in North American evangelical Christian settings, gatherings that happen beyond church settings sometimes have greater authority, particularly concerning the meaning and activity of worship. And participants in these, quote, parachurch, activities sometimes identify more strongly with the groups formed in these gatherings than with a local church congregation. And how fortunate for those of us who study music that music making, again, is one of the central activities and practices bringing people together in gatherings like these. In my study of North American evangelicalism, I found that it is the act of making a particular type of music together that marks an activity as worship and that renders a gathered assembly a congregation in the eyes and ears of its participants. My conversation partners in the field often describe to me their experience worshiping in gatherings outside the local church, comparing worship at their own churches, sometimes unfavorably, to worship experiences in which they had partaken elsewhere. And here, just a side note, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the example part. This is, present these comments to you as an observer, as someone who is noticing these things. I know that many of us, myself included, can place very strong evaluations on what is being said, on whether this is or should be our definition of worship. But for right now, I think taking a step back and noticing is important before we get to evaluating, critiquing, judging, etc. So some participants that I spoke to found worship concerts headlined by celebrity musicians to be, in the words of one college-age woman, quote, more sacred than church. Other participants described the collective singing at large national conventions as, quote, what heaven is going to be like. A few individuals I met online admitted that they felt able to most authentically worship when viewing devotional song videos shared on social media, where they felt part of the larger global body of believers. And many leaders in local church congregations spoke of an ever-present need to negotiate, whether that meant adapting songs, adopting songs, or rejecting the musical worship practices modeled by large parachurch conferences, powerful megachurches, and the transnational Christian commercial music industry. Each of these examples that I've mentioned show a Christian religious community that's formed, however temporarily or permanently in some cases, in the act of worshiping together through participatory music making. In order to bring our own understandings of congregational music in line with these on the ground and admittedly sometimes conflicting understandings of what religious community is and should be, I'm going to advocate an understanding of congregational music making that decenters the local church congregation and portrays it as one node, albeit a very important one, in a network that's comprised of many different sorts of gatherings. Some scholarship still privileges the church congregation as the central locus of music and worship practices, parsing practices into those that take place within the church, and then everything outside of it into one broad parachurch category. But church congregations, not only, I think one of the challenges we face is that not only are they a central unit for scholars who are looking at this phenomenon, their centrality is quite literally an article of faith for many church networks and denominations. Churches with congregational list polities, or those by definition, that define the local congregation as either the ontological or the phenomenological center of the Christian church. And here in my published work, there's a hefty footnote with portions of Churches of Christ, Baptist, and Mennonite confessions and church documents that go to support this. The ecclesial ontology that regards the local church congregation as the normative structure for faith and practice prevails even in some denominational structures with more formal hierarchies. James Neiman and Roger Haidt, writing from Lutheran and Catholic perspectives, these are ecclesiologists, respectively, they advocate that the local church congregation should be the primary focus of theological reflection because, quote, the primary unit of church that people experience is the congregation, end quote. And to be fair to them, they don't stop there, and I'll go on to engage aspects of their very helpful expanded definition a little bit later on. This prescriptive understanding of congregation as authentic context for Christian practice sometimes bleeds into even more distanced academic work. Many studies of congregational music making privilege church congregations in their methodological design, if not necessarily their philosophical assumptions, even though that the very same repertory of music that people are singing in church may be encountered in numerous other places. So I'm going to make a comparison that might seem a little bit strange at first. In much of our writing and thinking about congregational music making, I think the relationship between congregational song and the local church congregation can be compared to the relationship between, at least, what was the case before Mark Butler's fine work, between the electronic dance music and the dance floor. So this relationship is explored in detail by Mark Butler, who is a popular music theorist who himself engages a close examination of musical recordings of electronic dance music. So though electronic dance music is listened to and or danced to in other gatherings, Butler argues that the club dance floor oftentimes gets treated as the, quote, authentic locus of musical experience. In seeking to extend an understanding of electronic dance music beyond this context, Butler writes that, quote, although the significance of this site cannot be denied, it could also be argued that other important aspects of this music have been neglected because of the tendency to focus on this most immediate and obvious of social contexts. So to return to the ecclesiologists Neiman and Haidt, I propose that we work from a retooled and expanded understanding of congregation that includes, but extends beyond the local church. Neiman and Haidt note that those who study congregations know how difficult it can be to specify where the boundaries of such groups are actually located. Religious behavior, identity formation, and so forth occur in diverse parts of the lives of congregants. And so they propose that the focus of the field of congregational studies be on shared practices that unite participants across the boundaries of local institutional churches, advocating a shift in focus to, from the structure to the activity of those who gather through congregations. And it's this shift of congregation from structure to activity, or perhaps the structure that emerges from the activity of gathering, that we must make if congregational music is to have any explanatory power. So I want to suggest this shift in our thinking about congregations. Instead of congregation constantly needing to refer back to local church congregations, let's expand it and extend it to include other kinds of gatherings. Let's bring it back to its dictionary definition, and one that was very close to it that was mentioned earlier in the chat, meaning a group of people, Christians in this case, assembled for religious worship, with no necessary structural characteristics or institutional apparatus involved. Let's reimagine congregation as a temporary amalgamation rather than a reified structure, as a snapshot rather than a sculpture depicting a gathering of worshipers. So to stress the fluid, contingent, variegated nature of Christian gatherings, congregation as process, as well as product, if you will, I propose the additional term musical modes of congregating to describe the active creation of various social formations gathered for worship. For many Christians, evangelicals and charismatics, certainly, but not limited to these groups, the use of a certain kind of music called contemporary worship music, praise and worship music, immediately marks an activity as worship. Thus, collective music making is an important lens through which we can understand these Christian modes of congregating. And we can also examine how each of these different modes, you see here different modes that include people singing worship songs on the streets as part of a city demonstration. You see a concert, you see worship videos, you see live streamed services, these kinds of things. All of these are, while united perhaps by similar musical practices, there are different expectations and ways that each of these environments influence one another. So the modes of congregating that I've explored in the work referenced previously, Singing the Congregation, include conferences, concerts, small prayer groups, musical processions through public spaces, and online communities gathered for worship, either at the same time through a live stream or a common media object like a YouTube video. In all these cases, it's a shared musical repertory that provides the glue between the activities of singing together with a few dozen friends at a local church, church Sunday service, between joining one's voice with thousands at a concert or other mass event, singing with hands raised while processing down the street in a public demonstration, or singing online with a live streamed musical event. Though each of these experiences are marked as worship and involve participation in the same musical repertory, again, each is distinguished by a unique set of affordances. In other words, the associations and the activities that each of these performance spaces permit is distinct. An intimate local gathering, a public space, an online performance, or a regional or national large-scale event each provide a very different set of possibilities for the activity of worship. And as a result, each one has a bearing on participants' expectations and understanding of what it means and what it feels like to be part of a worshiping congregation. So I've noticed, I haven't had the chat up, but I've seen quite a lot go by. This is kind of my pause at the end of the second section. Let me stop sharing my screen for a moment and see if I could, I say Mike or Ben, if I could get some help with picking out a couple of comments to respond to. I'd appreciate it. You have to unmute yourself. I think if somebody's trying to, Mike, if you're trying to say something, you're muted.
There we go. I'm so sorry. I noticed a comment from Aaron Fulton.
I do it all the time.
about the term social worship, a 19th century term, which was denominationally mandated participation in social worship that could vary from all kinds of different things outside of the usual. Are you familiar with that at all?
I am not. Thank you, Aaron, for bringing up this term. I've not heard of the term social worship, but I would be fascinated to look it up. It sounds like from your comment here, tons of parallels. And that's one thing that I should, kind of go back and say is that by no means are these situations unique to us in the 21st century, or the fact that congregational song is happening outside, institutional kind of textbook definition, local church congregations. And I hope that I wasn't heard to suggest such. I think that there are certainly new possibilities that we are facing right now, owing to, again, the changing, changing technologies and changing ways that has influenced our social gatherings. But it's fascinating, and I think absolutely, useful to, to go back to some of these previous incarnations and think, okay, conceptually, what if we were to consider all of these different manifestations as modes of congregating, as, not, separated by this local church binary, except in cases where, where that itself, or where that binary is useful for the people who are invoking it, perhaps to claim authority for the traditional congregational spaces, or to claim authority for a denominational hierarchy, or what have you. But thank you, Aaron. Thank you for the comment.
There are a number of comments here that affirm your ways of speaking of congregation in a more ad hoc kind of sense, including one from Andreas Teich. But I was thinking also in Roman Catholic liturgical practice, the term assembly is being used quite a bit more frequently than congregation. In fact, I would say it's a deliberate decision to use that term more. And then there's a question here about the question of membership. So how do you relate that to what you're talking about right now?
That's an excellent question, and a very complicated one as well, because membership, there's been quite a bit of work on kind of in digital media studies and kind of online religious people who are studying online manifestations of religion, talking about the various degrees, of course, to that what's called virtual worship. We talked about not particularly appreciating that term, but online versus live manifestations, ways that's challenging who's in and who's out. I mean, there are multiple levels. Just thinking about some of one of my colleagues, Tom Wagner, who's written about Hillsong and has done quite a bit of work with their social media, brings in some of that scholarship to talk about, the multiple levels of belonging that a worship brand like Hillsong can encourage, from people who watch all of the live stream services to engage with all of the media, who are would describe themselves as super fans or or something, all the way down to someone who on occasion partakes of of one of their songs online, or occasionally writes into their to their chat or participates. I think that question of membership in particular has been complicated by the online situation, and of course, to bring up the examples that we have talked about earlier. I mean, what does it mean to be a part of a local local congregation in the age of live stream services, where people are tuning in, where some of my minister friends, I don't know who is still doing this, but I had some friends who were so excited that they could finally attend other churches on a Sunday morning, and so were attending 3 or 4 of their friends' congregations regularly. I think that those are all just excellent signs that this of how complicated the definition has become, and lends credence to the point of these ecclesiologists and so many others that our definition has got to change along with the ecosystem. So thank you for those insightful comments. I will continue to share my screen and come back to my third point. Okay, the concert congregation is the example. So I've been speaking of these congregations on a somewhat abstract level. So now let's delve into details by looking more closely at the dynamics that characterize one of these musical modes of congregating outside the local church. And just to tell you, I chose the worship concert as my example for today, long before I knew just how long it would be before we could gather like this again. So I'm going to acknowledge now the weird nostalgia I'm feeling in talking about mass gatherings. And also, parenthetical note before I get started as well, the concert congregation, I think this is going to be one of those that we, and I certainly, are perhaps most tempted to launch into criticisms and what this has done, to worship in our congregations and things. And I'd like to, while critique and criticism and evaluation, all of these things are absolutely crucial, I'd like to again approach this in stepping back and in this posture of observation, of noticing, of listening to what goes on in these spaces, and and how people for whom these are profoundly meaningful are experiencing them. And then, of course, bring on the evaluation and the critique. So one of the modes of congregating that I write about is a performance space that evangelicals refer to as worship concerts, worship events, or sometimes worship experiences. No, they don't use the term concert congregation, that's mine. But these are concerts featuring celebrity worship leaders and bands, drawing crowds often numbering in the many thousands. Between 2007 and 2013, I attended 12 of these events in different parts of the US, also in Canada and in the UK as well. And there's a strong resemblance between worship concerts, of course, and stadium rock concerts. Both have extravagant multimedia and lighting displays. They have rock bands at center stage, amplification, performer-audience interaction that often characterizes musical entertainment events, such as cheering and applause. Many other elements of these events, however, resemble what goes on in a local church. The large screens project song lyrics to each and every song to encourage audience members to sing along. Leaders proclaim the words of biblical texts and lead public prayer while modeling devotional gestures such as raising hands and faces as if towards heaven. And these performative elements help to authenticate the gathering as more than just a mere concert, but rather as, to use our term of the day, as a congregation that is gathered for the express purpose of worshiping God. Concert tours of celebrity worship leaders then often become, you could think of them as proving grounds where artists and brands and products seek to be authenticated as inspiring real worship. And there was a lot of anxiety during the time that during this time period and continuing among evangelicals about authenticity in worship. And others have written about this. I also have a lot of thoughts, but we'll press on for the sake of time. Just know, how do you know that worship is authentic, especially in an environment that looks like this? One principle that evangelicals commonly cited when asked is that authentic worship must be participatory, that it must be the opposite of what they understood as performance. So in contrast to an arena rock performance, authentic worship must be, as British worship leader Tim Hughes put it, a participator sport in a spectator culture. So how Christians, the evangelical Christians that I talked to, understood the contrast between performance and participation is critical, because this is one of the means, the primary means that they're able to experience worship concerts as worshiping congregations. And to further tease out the contrast, I like to draw from two categories of live performance that are proposed by ethnomusicologist Thomas Torino. In Music and Social Life, the Politics of Participation, which I would commend to anyone. We read this in lots of my courses at Baylor. It's a wonderful, although not focused on Christian worship and music particularly, so many applicable points. Torino conceives different types of music making as being what he calls distinct fields of practice that are characterized by widely differing goals, values, social positions, and power relationships. So Torino describes two types of live performance: those participatory performances and presentational performances. So to define those very quickly for you, participatory performances are those live performances in which there is no firm distinction between artists and audience members, though they may perform different roles in whatever music making is happening. So the goals of participatory performance is, quote, is to involve the maximum number of people in some performance role. As a result, these performances use several strategies to encourage participation. And I love Torino's work for this. He has done, he's done work on 5 continents and is drawing in, examples, everything from, Cajun Zydeco to Zimbabwean mbira to Peruvian Aymara flute music to kind of illustrate these commonalities in participatory music making across the world and across cultures. So some of these strategies for encouraging everyone to get involved include repetition on several levels, from repeating, words, phrases, musical or otherwise, verses, and so on. A de-emphasis on virtuosity, at least in parts of the music making. I enjoy this one, a consistently loud volume and dense texture that serves a cloaking function, Torino's words, that encourage novice musicians to join in without fear of embarrassment. So think about that. Organists, worship band musicians, you all serve a cloaking function in your congregational singing. So presentational performance, on the other hand, to take the other category, by contrast, there's a distinct separation between artists who make the music and audience members who receive and appreciate it, but aren't actively involved in sound production. Presentational performances are well rehearsed with musical works in more or less stable arrangements that feature frequent contrasts of many different sonic features. So variety rather than repetition is the hallmark of presentational performance. Presentational performances further are usually, not always, scripted into a prearranged order that provides variety in order to maintain the audience's attention. Or in the case of improvised genres, you're not going to hear something sung, the same way twice. There's constant variety that is encouraging people to to tune in. Through drawing this conceptual distinction, Torino argues that in practice, participatory and presentational performances frequently overlap. I think we can all see elements of this in anything that we do, in our churches, and that a given musical performance can be understood as a compromise between the two types of musical activity. So these are the poles, but in reality, in real life, it's a spectrum that we can be, even in the same song, we can be at different points on. The worship concert, I think, is an example par excellence of an event that attempts to be a hybrid of the differing values, goals, and social roles of participatory and presentational performance. So rather than understanding the worship concert as a space of compromise, however, worship leaders and worshipers that I spoke with oftentimes attempted to define the activity as wholly participatory, that it's not meant to be a performance, or using the categories in front of you, a presentational performance at all. So again, going back to authenticity, in order to be authentic worship, the worship concert must be experienced as a participatory performance, where the boundary between the worship leader at center stage and the audience member in the stadium seats is collapsed, because both are engaged in the act of worship. Attendees must understand themselves and the worship leaders on stage as worshipers, equal participants in the activity of worship. They do so by emphasizing the participatory qualities and values and distancing themselves from the social roles and goals of presentational performance. Despite, and kind of drawing from literary critic Lionel Trilling here, the rhetoric of disavowal, we might call. However, as you can imagine, and I'm sure as many of you are, many steps ahead thinking about, many of the aesthetic values and patterns of social organization that mark presentational performance shape profoundly the musical activities of the worship concert, and then by extension, the many other congregations that participants are part of. Concert attendees become a worshiping congregation through engaging in the same participatory actions that constitute congregational worship in church. The most important of these, of course, is singing. At worship concerts, the expectation is that everyone in attendance sing, and it is reiterated again and again in multiple ways. Doesn't fail through all the events that I was at. This expectation is reiterated to the point of redundancy. The lyrics to every song are projected, and there are enough screens scattered across the stadium. I think you noticed, let me go back to yes, all the screens. There are enough screens to make sure that everyone can see the lyrics. Celebrity worship leaders reinforce repeatedly throughout worship concerts the imperative that concert goers sing. They exhort the worship concert crowd to sing louder or more fervently, and they give the crowd opportunities to sing verses or choruses unaccompanied by amplified voices or instruments, just the voices now. As they sing, participants engage in other practices that often accompany worship in local churches, such as raising hands, bowing their heads in prayer, and all of these actions that they're engaged in serve to mark the activity as worship and reinforce the sense that concert audience members are full participants in this act. At the same time as worship concerts emphasize these aspects, they of course also embody many of the values and social roles of presentational performances. And, I probably don't need to mention most of these to you. Obvious markers include the spatial centering, the fact that, David Crowder isn't sitting in the bleachers here performing to you. Professional bands on a raised stage, demarcated social roles of performers and audiences who are paying rock concert ticket prices for the privilege of singing along with their favorite recording artists, and of course, the amplified wall of sound that facilitates, even as it covers over, the gathered crowd singing. One could argue that the wall of amplified sound is intended to facilitate maximum collective participation, to provide that cloaking function I mentioned earlier that encourages even the worshiper who believes she can't sing to lift her voice. Worshipers at worship concerts know they're expected to sing and are often highly invested in doing so. But to understand more deeply the dynamics of participation at worship concerts, I think it's important to ask what it is that concert goers hear when they are singing, and how they experience their own voices in relationship to the collective sound of the gathered concert congregation. The intense physical involvement and effort of concert congregations, as so many people that I spoke to, report being hoarse, after one of these for days because they've just sung their hearts out. The intense physical involvement often belies the oral output. And I want to, read an account. So kind of drawing from, my own experience as I tried to analyze what's going on, some of the sounds that I heard. This was a practice that I did quite often when I was a part of these worship concerts, as kind of check in with myself as a singer. What is it that I see? What is it that I hear? How are these things, shaping what I am producing, or how I'm thinking about, how I'm noticing? So in some ways, this is, I love, noticing this activity that is, that Music That Makes Community has emphasized to us. That it has done. I am also sorry. My computer screen is not registering the time on here, and so I've answered quite a bit more questions than I anticipated. I think what I'm going to do, instead of draw from my experience here, I'm going to go ahead and talk about. And just sum up my my responses so that we'll have enough time for maybe a question at the end. So just to sum this up, in the worship concert, as well as most others I attended, it was often difficult or impossible to hear individual voices of the people sitting nearby. The exception that stands out is an outdoor music festival where all permitting amplification was not possible. Singing along was something that that singers I talked to, as well as those of a colleague musicologist, Josh Busman, talked about, where singing along at a worship concert allows concert goers the experiential pleasure of participating in full voice singing without compromising the aesthetic values of the presentational performance. Is the worship concert an example of kind of having your participatory and presentational cake and eating it too? For some, it does seem that way. And the dynamics of the worship concert, of course, are not limited to the concert congregation. Rather, they spill over into other modes of congregating. And I talked to so many people who have been influenced, profoundly, and who were taking their expectations of what worship should sound like and feel like from these mass events, and were so eager for that to come to their own gatherings. The young woman I mentioned earlier who talked about, the concert worship experience was more sacred than church because she was able to share this time with an understanding with people who she believed understood what real worship was. So these conversations and others like them reveal the degree to which concert congregations and other kinds of gatherings have become inextricably intertwined, even as we try to reframe and reinterpret elements of popular music performance. Elements from the concert congregation are actively shaping our understanding of what worship is. And I think we can think about, and I had a section in here about implications for congregations that, for instance, the Walmart mom and pop shop phenomenon of interviewees leaving small churches who are incapable of living up to their expectations, or using YouTube videos as a background because they don't feel their musicians are up to par. So what's significant about the worship concert as a mode of congregating is that it serves as an intermediate space, I think, between stadium rock concerts and what goes on in churches. Whatever you may think about its ethics or aesthetics, the worship concert is an influential mode of congregating that asks evangelicals to choose which aspects of popular music culture can and should be incorporated into the heart of worship. And a sentence to sum up, and then Mike, if we have any time, taking another couple of comments. I think that if we deploy congregation and congregational music making in the ways that I've suggested, this retooled concept offers much more explanatory power for the ways contemporary religious practice is influenced by media and mobility. It can explain the continuity of Christian experience between different performance spaces, as in the specific case of how the worship concert mediates between rock concert and church service. And by adjusting our understanding of congregations in this way, I think we can better understand the lived experience of participants for whom the local church is just one of several modes of congregating that's meaningful to them. And thank you so much for listening, for your participation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Monique. We are just about at time, but I would like to raise one issue that came up in the chats. There's lots of stuff in there, but the question I'd like to raise has to do with the notions of congregating and worship on the one hand, and then the issues of access, power, and commodification that seem inherent in the concert congregation experience.
Absolutely, and Dr. Jones this morning, I think, already primed the pump for us thinking about commodification of the worship experience. And I think for that, I hope this isn't. I know that our time is short, and I don't want to run you all over. You've got lunch to eat and things. That is something that a number of scholars have taken on. Is this, how is commodification influencing spiritual formation, influencing all of these other aspects of worship? And I would point you to, in fact, whoever wants to, please do email me. I can send you a list of resources. Obviously, please do pick up my book that this is based on. Chapter 1 has a great deal of material where I'm talking about the concert space, draws from and expands on the work of many of my colleagues on commodification, talking about branding and how that has played into how that is shaping what's going on in these churches. It's a huge concern, and it's a fertile area for research, and happy to send along resources for you to think and read further.
Can people email you directly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. I'm at, I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but I'm at Monique_Ingalls at Baylor, or at my Gmail address goes to the same place, Monique.Ingalls@gmail. So.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Monique. This has been an incredibly packed and interesting, informative session. I think we're all really grateful for your good work.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much.
And thanks to everybody. Now, if you're a full conference participant, we're going to gather again at 2:30 Eastern time for our breakout conversation, which is sort of a synthesizing conversation on the conference theme led by Marilyn Haskell and Ben Brody. And then for everyone at 7:30 tonight is our closing event of the conference, which is the evening event with Diana Sanchez-Bouchon everything old is new again. So hope to see all of you at one or the other or both of those events later on. Thanks again.
Right.
Bye-bye,
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye.